really excited to have Leah here with us, and I heard Leah speak, I think for the first time this summer. I heard her give a short talk at the Met Brewer, the former Whitney Museum, as part of a program with Storefront and the Met. And I found it really refreshing because not only was Leah a very passionate speaker, but she was, in that particular talk, taking on a phenomenon that for the last several years has been a sacred cow of sorts for a variety of fields, that is the sharing economy. And even though her critique has serious implications, she was doing it with wit and humor, and that really resonated with me, and I think resonated with what we try to do here, which is not just research and write, but engage an audience to listen. So Leah is an urbanist and geographic information system, GIS, methodologist, and she is now an assistant professor at Columbia's GSAP program. And her research deals with issues of spatial justice, informational ethics, and the effects of infrastructural networks on the construction of social and political space. And professionally, Leah has contributed to several experimental and exploratory practices dealing with 21st century urbanism. Some of those include co-founding Office MG, a spatial systems consultancy. She served as director of research at Spatial Project Office, and she also co-founded Pre-Office, a design and research studio that investigated the organizational structures behind design processes in the wake of the US foreclosure crisis. She holds a Master's of Architecture and an MS in Urban Planning from Columbia, and a BA in Art, Architecture, and Urbanism from Smith College. So please join me in welcoming Leah Meisterlin.
I will talk about sharing. I will get to talk about sharing, I promise. I don't know if I'll be as funny as I was this summer, though. That's a little bit of pressure. So first of all, hi, I'm Leah. Thank you very much to SVA and the Design Research Program for inviting me to speak. And in particular, thank you to Molly for offering me an opportunity to, in our emails when I agreed, said that I would sort of do a kind of a survey of some of my recent work and thinking, which has given me an unplanned for but desperately needed opportunity to consider and reflect upon the work that I've been doing, which I think we're probably, most of us might be in, I would assume, at this moment, especially if your work pertains to social and political effects of the rapid and rampant changes in our world. As it is, the hardest part about talking about my work and most of my projects is often explaining what it is exactly I do. So usually I like to describe myself as an urbanist. As it turns out, no one knows what that means. Or more accurately, that doesn't really mean anything to anyone. And I've also learned that then following that with, well, I study cities, doesn't ever clarify anything. So by way of introduction, as Molly said, I'm trained as an architect and an urban planner, and I usually work at the intersection of the two. That's somewhere between design and policy, and or you can think about it, me working within the built environment as it's constructed both physically as well as socially and politically. This looks wildly reductive, but go with it. I'm also, as was mentioned, a geographic information systems methodologist, another phrase that means nothing to anyone. Basically, it means that in the studying of cities, I also look at the ways in which different information technologies, specifically systems of spatial information, affect cities. I look at the way these systems and the information they produce are analyzed and visualized, and I do my best to design new methods whenever or wherever I find existing methods lacking. Somewhere in the intersection of that Venn diagram then sits most of what I do. Given the nature of that intersection, it means that I make a lot of maps, a few of which I will show you. Except this diagram is a little bit spatially misleading, and since I just said I make maps, I should give you one that characterizes the overlap a little better. So largely given my background, I use spatial data and mapping practices as a hinge between the disciplines of architecture and planning. As much as the work is about the analysis of very large spatial systems, it's also about the literal drawing of those systems, their techniques of graphic representation as tools for considering and communicating the functioning of those systems. Okay, fine. That's all fine and good, and hopefully that lays some sort of foundation for me to say what it actually is I do. Generally speaking, most projects try to do multiple things. The operative word here is try. I employ and sometimes develop specific mapping techniques to reveal structural conditions not previously visible. In doing that, out of sheer necessity, I have to study the outcomes produced by certain digital technologies in a built environment that's being altered and hybridized by a sort of constantly reforming and very uneven landscape of information. I ask how new practices of visualization are informing architectural and urban design process, and how new practices of data analysis are informing individual decision-making, as well as collective planning for cities. In other words, how we're creating new geographies of access and agency. And while asking all those sorts of questions is certainly worthwhile in its own right, I'm a designer, and y'all know designers are a rather proactive bunch. We've got to make things, right? So I try, again, there's that word, to translate what I learn into new tools, new pedagogies, and new methods. Usually I try to do the three together for more inclusive and representative and pluralistic practices for city making. Whew. So let's start with an example. It's a map most of you, I assume, probably already know. Yes? Hands up if you don't. Oh, no, hands up if you do. Okay, that means I get to tell you about it. This is John Snow's cholera map depicting deaths by cholera in the Soho neighborhood of London during an outbreak in the fall of 1854. For those of you who haven't seen it before, you read it like a bar chart wrapped along the street network. Let's see if I know how to zoom on a Mac. I do. So you can see, like, stacked off the edge of the street are the number of deaths per household, or per address, we'll say. And this map is important in a great many ways. Snow was able to use this map to argue that, contrary to the miasmatic theory of disease, cholera was not only waterborne, but that one water pump in particular, sitting at the center of the map almost, was the source of the infection in this neighborhood. House to house, he went, he collected the data, he worked with a cartographer to map it, saw that everyone was dying around the Broad Street pump, convinced authorities to shut it down by removing the handle on the pump, and in the process became the godfather of public health, the patron saint of data mapping and GIS, and kicked off a paradigm-shifting understanding of epidemiology. Easy peasy, right? It's the magic we enjoy of combining data visualization with our sort of distinctively human abilities for pattern recognition and interpretation. It's an early example of the sort of thing that we see and do all the time nowadays, right? Yes, but no, and really not so much at all. The truth is that this map doesn't actually logically disprove the idea that miasmas were to blame, at least not by itself. To take that one step further, if we look at the city beneath the data, so this is a remapping of his map, and if we remember that collecting water is a more or less daily activity, and we consider the system of access provided by the street system, we see that while people were dying around the Broad Street pump, again in the center of the map, right there, while they were dying around the Broad Street pump, roughly half of those households were actually closer to other water pumps. Right? They were roughly half of them are actually closer to clean water. And so I'm not suggesting here that John Snow's interpretation of his data was wrong, or of his map. On the contrary, I'm citing this example in particular to talk about a few different things. The first is that the visualization of one singular data set might draw us a pattern, but it can't ever tell you the story, right? We know that acquiring water is a daily activity, and even though water is very heavy to carry, daily activities are usually determined by convenience. They are rarely, if ever, their own sort of standalone errands, right? If it were a standalone errand, you'd go to the closest one and then come right back home. In this particular time and place, we also know how street life functioned, 19th century London, right? And it isn't until we contextualize the cholera deaths within the city, within the specific spatial practices of this place and this culture, that the map actually starts to support an indictment of the Broad Street pump. We understand that some wide streets are barriers and boundaries between neighborhoods, while others are sort of central arteries and collectors or main streets, if you will, within different neighborhoods. And so even if other water pumps are physically or spatially more proximal, they weren't necessarily socio-spatially more proximal. Mapping the data, in short, here simply isn't enough to make sense of what's going on. It's the what's needed is the relationship between the information and the city in order to make the argument. Second takeaway then is that the data alone can't really tell any story other than how it was created. That someone had a certain question and a certain balance of resources and constraints and a certain framework for answering that question within which he or she collected some information. And that part is super important. In Jon Snow's case, he didn't get lucky by having picked the right spot or collected the right data at the right time, nor did he turn his map into insight or that data into insight when he mapped it. He had previously hypothesized that cholera was waterborne. He knew that the Broad Street pump was part of a different infrastructural water system than all of the pumps around it. You can see how many he mapped. They're all the white circles. He knew that that pump in particular pulled water from further downstream on the Thames than all of the nearby surrounding pumps. And again, the specific conditions of the built environment are key here. And so he set up a natural experiment, keeping almost everything constant except the source of this one pump. And when the next outbreak hit, he was ready. He collected the data to confirm and then demonstrate his hypothesis. What we're seeing that means is the theoretical and conceptual framework about how cholera works, by which and then into which he fit his approach to data collection. The map is a confirmation of a theory that he already held. It's not the beginning of a new one. And I can't stress this enough, okay? By virtue of its creation, that means, I'm using this as an example to say there is no raw data. It has already perspective. It's already been framed and filtered by the theories and the worldviews of those who ask the questions and those with the resources to collect it. There's a sort of urgency in the last few weeks. I'm going to repeat that. The data is already framed and filtered by the theories and worldviews of those who ask the questions and those with the resources to collect it. That doesn't mean that once mapped, it isn't also interpreted, right? The last takeaway I'll pull from this example is that if we accept that one spatial data set can't tell a full story by itself, and if we take seriously and are sensitive to the relationship between that information and the material and social environment from which it's drawn, then, get it ready, very new and very exciting opportunities open up for us. Here in this example, we're able to reverse engineer what's happening in just one aspect of daily life, 150, almost 200 years ago, based on that relationship. I'm able to reconstruct the boundaries of a neighborhood. I'm able to approximate, quotidian spatial practices within that neighborhood as more than just sort of on-the-ground measured distance, but as a meaningful distance of physical access, temporal convenience, as well as patterns of behavior, right? So this is a palate cleanser. A lot has changed since Jon Snow's cholera map. Today, the data is bigger, denser, ubiquitous, highly structured. That's not to say it's substantially different. It is still residual. I'll put the residue back up. The information most of us deal with and design with still comprises the artifacts or the residue that follows our attempts to systematically understand human behavior in situ. It's the residue of that process of data collection and the worldview we brought to it. And so creating meaning from that residue, using it to reach new conclusions, make new decisions, design new plans for cities and so on, becomes part of a sort of what I'm going to call right now negotiated alchemy. I should say that this is not data science, right? This is not a process the way that Snow sort of conducted of setting up the experiment to collect the information to test a hypothesis. This is not a process that in any way replicates scientific methods, this alchemy I'm talking about, but more closely resembles exploratory proto-science with an almost metaphysical devotion to where the data comes from. Data analysis in this way is a process of cleaning it, distilling it, reverse engineering its intentions, combining and recombining it to see what each new Frankenstein might yield. Yes, I said Frankenstein. I'm currently convinced that our best work in this field right now are exquisite monsters born of recombination. We pick apart what we need from each source based on our most informed understanding of their origins, and out of that we develop techniques to stitch those pieces back together to reveal geographies of distance we couldn't see before. In this example, we're looking at 19th century New York, roughly the same time period. And a little fuzzy, but the two maps on the left are the primary layers that go into figuring out population density by block during that time period. The one on the lower left is the highest resolution the census has available to us, which does not show us really the levels of difference or differentiation, the landscape of density across lower Manhattan. That's everything south of 42nd Street. And then we do that again, right? This time developing even more new techniques to handle the perspectives and the biases of our own newly created data. So I've reinterpreted that, folding those findings in with other information about the built environment to get an understanding of crowding as it would have been understood or thought of in the 19th century, which is, you know, whether or not your housing offered you reasonable access to light and air. Okay. The other reason for words like Frankenstein, to call these things Frankensteins, is that this kind of alchemy requires a different way of seeing the maps it produces. What they represent are opportunities for visualizing like several layers, one at a time, and then together in order to sort of, again, visualize longstanding criticisms of GIS and data mapping more broadly. Right now, we're standing at a moment where we can actually mobilize outside of academia and put into practice these social critiques. Not only in scholarly work, but again, in practice, we can actually operationalize concepts like Lefebvre's representational spaces as lived and as perceived. We could operationalize Peter Marcuse's cities and quarters. But this means seeing each map as but one in a sort of multi-perspectival city. And it means that long before we can think about things like the distribution of infrastructure or of jobs, we have to be willing to see and map concepts like density and distance differently. For example, we know that different groups have varying commands of space, right, or of distance and the spatial resources around them, because at the very least, not everyone has the same control over their time. Right? So, in other words, the distance between A and B depends on who you are and who you ask. So, if we can do this sort of alchemy, if we can deploy, then of course we could deploy that alchemy, combining data sets, interpreting and reinterpreting their meanings and their relationships, both as visualizations of difference, the differences we see across the urban environments, and as representations of difference we experience within that environment. That alchemical process might then become a tool for negotiation and mediation of that difference, recombining according to new priorities or different experiences or competing political agendas. By definition, it could constitute a sort of tool for a kind of democratic spatial politic, for both acknowledging the pluralism of cities, which is sometimes hard for us to do collectively, it turns out, and negotiating visions and outcomes for those cities. Maybe, such tools would allow us to leverage our differences toward finding their alignment, their overlap, their commonality, their opportunities for shared intervention and envisioning. And knowing that each new visualization results from an analysis of extraordinarily loaded and perspectival inputs with their own characteristics and properties, what I'm describing here is, well, what's important here is actually that I take a brief sidebar. I'm talking through a couple different points while making weird references to medieval metaphysics and science fiction, while also obliquely hitting 20th century ideas of advocacy and pluralism reconfigured through big data and its new possibilities, and some community organizing thrown in on top, sprinkled in on top, right? And what I want to be clear about is that, frankly, nothing I'm actually describing is particularly new. And yet, when we examine a variety of current spatial data visualizations, the ones mostly being produced right now, when we consider, for example, the ease with which one pumps out heat maps from a super user-friendly heat map making bit of software, and I don't want to call anybody out. So instead, I've thrown up examples, So instead, I've thrown up a collage of examples of what my students make when I, their crazy magic when I teach alternative and pluralistic approaches to data mapping. Okay, so I don't want to call anybody out, but but I'm going to assume you all can conjure up dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, super user-friendly heat maps pumped out by heat map making software or apps. And also you can consider, what happens when one scrapes data from any number of sources while completely ill-equipped to question the framework that outright determined what that data would include and say. That worldview, that all-important framing worldview. When we look at the methods and the assumptions and the perspectives and the ontologies underpinning those visualizations, what we find here are data practices that are more often than not radically different than the kind of alchemy I'm talking about. They're fundamentally different than the notion that none of this should rightfully be called science, that this sort of inquiry or design isn't about finding a truth about what happens in the city, right? Or that acknowledging, and they're fundamentally sort of different than even sort of knowing that in order to acknowledge multiple communities within a city, we must be ready to know that most data mapping just can't describe urban space as each of those communities actually experiences it, right? Instead, what we tend to find are visualization practices that believe the first seductive image rendered. We find cartographic practices that dislocate information from its context based on analyses that are often inappropriate to its settings, right? We find maps that sort of prioritize the ability to plot points at X's and Y's over interpreting the fact that at those X's and Y's are people who understand that location differently than other locations. We find conclusions drawn from graphic storytelling that doesn't account for all of the other narratives we might have seen if only we had dug a little bit deeper to find the differences. In our sort of constant need to make the complexity of our urban systems a little less complicated, we seem to be making the mistake of oversimplifying it, of reducing the effects of difference. And I know that saying this right now is extra loaded, and that's probably why I'm saying it, because I also know that the US electoral process is a geographic one, and I know what happens when we forget about pluralism and oversimplify spatial differences in our data. So, with all that in mind, let's talk about a few new digital techniques. Digital technologies built on about that same trifecta I mentioned before, physical access, temporal convenience, and patterns of behavior in cities. Technologies that produce and collect a lot of geographic data about movement and interaction, and technologies that are altering our relationship to the resources of urban space and maybe even our relationships to each other. We're going to talk about sharing. I've been working on the social and spatial practices implied by an urbanism of sharing. And my speculations here come out of research on the transactional relationships the platform, this so-called platform economy, we'll call it, creates, and how those might be restructuring our interpersonal economies, both formal and informal. But sharing, in particular, is a problematic word. While it applies to several examples within the sharing economy, it can also be a relatively misleading misnomer particularly when it suggests a sort of collectivism upon which some relatively new arena for exchange is developing. But what is new might only be the form of that arena, or that market, we should call it, because that's what it is, or the individually scaled experience of operating within it. And I would posit that what is less new, or maybe not new at all, are the protocols by which that market functions. To call the sharing economy indeed sharing, and here I'm talking about the whole spectrum, right? From digital platforms to enable short-term rentals, to on-demand alternative ride sharing, and all the points in between, is really to overly simplify a complex collection of activities with on-the-ground relationships to built and lived-in cities. More so, however, to call this all sharing is to standardize and massify a diverse array of projects and products, and most importantly, a diverse array of actors with a correspondingly diverse array of experiences. This normalizing, this flattening, it diminishes the effects of difference, whether they be discord or diversity. And in other words, by collecting these strategies together under the single banner of sharing, we not only lose nuance, but we're collecting information by default because of the way these things function. They produce and collect tons of information within a standardized and undifferentiated framework. Let me demonstrate some of the differences in opinion and difference. Okay, so tons of differences. I'm going to highlight differences in the debate. And some of you have seen this list before, but I'm going in a different direction. So we're going to demonstrate some of those differences via difference in perspective that result from this kind of digital tech, the sharing platform, with a very quick and very generalized pros and cons list. You guys see that? What some call micro-entrepreneurship, others will call atomized labor. Let's see if I can get my left and right. Okay. While some will advocate for vulnerable communities, arguing that these platforms offer much-needed short-term income, others will advocate for those exact same communities, arguing that these are Band-Aid measures distracting from larger imperatives. And I saw Taylor Swift on the screen before, so in the immortal words of Taylor, we should all remember, Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. Okay. Back to the list. Many will describe the ability to temporarily convert a personal asset into a commercial asset as a sustainably efficient allocation of what we know are very limited urban resources. And others will cite such instances as violations against regulations designed for a reason, right? Designed for the health, safety, and welfare of our neighborhoods and our communities. I've got more. Networked on-demand resources, on one hand good, can also be described as fragile systems insofar as they're surge-prone. At present, good, we're establishing patterns wherein increased opportunity and rapid change, in other words, innovation, comes at the expense of bad collective oversight and our ability to anticipate consequences. On one hand, the efficient allocation of those individually owned goods is also presenting new and unmet costs for our public infrastructure. Again, back to the good side, the localized focus of use value of goods and services, right, sort of hyper-local economic development has opened up markets that, less good, move beyond just the financialization of property to create new instruments that actually capitalize on the access to property regardless of ownership. Back to good. Widespread, less good, low-level financial gains to millions of people, good, still pale in comparison to what others will call basically robber baron levels of concentrated aggregated revenues and value generation. In short, what some will call flexibility, others will call instability. And from here, it really isn't a stretch to argue that the platform economy, for all of its pros, also exacerbates income inequality. And in urbanistic terms, and at a large enough scale, these platforms, once they spread, hold the capacity to convert a substantial portion of the world's cities, or rather those living within the world's cities, into a sort of digital global hinterland, extracting both capital and labor from every sharer on the planet. What's more curious or disconcerting, depending on your perspective, is that these lists can be read as private pros and public cons. The left is mostly a list of small-scale benefits that are realized, experienced, or valued by individuals. And strangely enough, The right list looks mostly like the list of costs, which are pretty much the things that we ultimately share. So like I said, I've presented this list before, and I know a few people in the room have seen me present this list before. And I'm not actually here to say that one of these lists is more correct than the other. Rather, I'd like to use this list to introduce a recent project on the nature of sharing platforms. So here we go. Share is a digital platform designed for Copenhagen by a team of 5 very different designers, of which I am one, commissioned by the 2016 Oslo Architecture Triennale, which has its overall theme was called After Belonging, and it sort of investigated questions of transience and shifting meanings of what it is to belong right now. So I'm gonna say that again. A group of Spanish curators working for curating the Oslo Architecture Triennial commissioned a group of New York-based designers to design an intervention for Copenhagen. That's what happened. Okay. We call it a prototype as provocation. It's part instigation, it's part satire, it's part genuine offering for the world in intervention, it's part engagement-based research, it's part interaction design, or a part interaction design problem and project to think about, depending on whom you ask, depending on each one of our perspectives. Like I said, 5 very different designers. I won't speak for all of them, I'll hold myself to account. The project takes at its basis the trends of we're seeing further incrementalization and monetization of space and time in this manner of sharing, and it allows insofar as it allows its users to rent or reserve individual objects by the minute. Individual objects by the minute. Further, the platform is absolutely agnostic to whether those objects are privately owned, sort of personal objects, or publicly shared objects within the city. And that's a sort of nod and kind of a somewhat problematizing poke at the confusion between public and private spheres, or the disillusionment of their boundary, as well as sort of public and private interests. This is another one of our marketing images. The beta is in fact live at share.city. Go forth and have fun. Users manually outline the objects they post to the platform, masking out their context, highlighting through the act of drawing, right? And with their descriptive text, the objects, the meaning or the value that it holds for them. This is a fairly this sort of act of masking is fairly straightforward for a coffee pot or some cups or one's dryer. Should you get caught in the rain before you need to be at a meeting, you can imagine 15 minutes in there, you're all good, someone's dryer. So fairly straightforward for discrete individual objects. It's a bit harder to offer up a spot at your couch, or let's say your dining table for a freelancer who just needs to take a Skype call and some peace and quiet for about an hour. And it's incredibly variable, this act of masking, for if you're trying to offer up or suggest to others your favorite piece of sunshine in a neighborhood park, right? But through this variation, the platform becomes more than a forum for exchange, and to possibly actually speak to the ways different individuals or members of different communities see, use, and value their city. It's also, incidentally, a research tool for collecting those sorts of perspectives within data structures that are far more accepting of difference than some of the others that we are pretty familiar with. The project itself, the commission from the Triennale and from the curators, was not actually to produce an app. Rather, we were charged with conducting a 1-year intervention in Copenhagen. And so in many ways, the platform is actually a decoy for a community engagement project. The provocation of the platform was an opportunity to draw out the sort of perceived trade-offs, the pros and the cons of the sharing economy as it's understood in a specific context right? In a place with a long history and a very specific history of collectivity, Danish culture, a strong social state, which is undergoing some change at the moment, but also a long history of things like co-housing, et cetera. It was an opportunity to learn the sort of nuance of social practice, the changing social practices of this place, and to sort of suss out their relationship to emerging spatial and digital practices. On a more personal note, it also proved, this project, as a sort of decoy platform for the design team's own process of negotiation and trade-offs, et cetera. And through that decoy, we were able to draw out our own kind of competing priorities, agendas, and politics, because I'm sure that I know that the five of us would write that pros and cons list very, very differently. So actually, I'd like to go back to it. And this is where I sort of stop reading, because I have to. So before I finish up, I want to return to the pros and cons list, because I realized recently that there's another way to read the opposition here. And I said just a bit ago, or implied just a bit ago, that the sort of rhetorical, and didn't directly say, but it's true, sort of algorithmic approach to sharing sort of massifies experience, how we see the world around us, and sort of starts to massify the worldview through which we glimpse it. And I also said that at a large enough scale, these platforms hold the capacity to convert portions of the world's cities into a global hinterland. I can extend that claim, it turns out, to other kinds of digital platforms, obviously, social media platforms especially, when we think about the volume and the value of the data created by their users. And in the last few weeks, I realized that these lists have started to depict another set of dual experiences. And the list on the left starts to read like what one sees from within the sort of advantage landscape of like the processes of urbanization and globalization, right? And that comes with a sort of concomitant worldview of cosmopolitanism. These are benefits that you're able to capture if you're able to access some of those technologies, if you're able to incorporate some of those practices into your life. And I realized that the list on the left starts to look a lot like what falls away from you if you are not, right? If you are a member of what we call global cities, it starts to become really important, I think, to acknowledge that vectors have starting points. The flows of resources and information and access and connectivity and all of those increases within global cities are pulled from somewhere. And so it's starting to suggest another geography of difference, one that is differentiated in sort of different spatial patterns that exists within cities, in marginalized and minority communities. It also exists outside of cities for those who are not positioned to take advantage of and participate in these rapidly changing sort of contexts, right? Starting to essentially belonging to what I'm increasingly referring to as a kind of digital or global hinterland. I'm winging this part here because this part is kind of new. And the SHARE project, in fact, concluded less than a month ago in Copenhagen with a roundtable discussion. And I flew to Copenhagen the day after the election, and that basically took over the entire roundtable discussion. And what we experienced in the sort of finissage closing event, which became very informal and quite moving, I would say. And it was a discussion of the possibilities and the questions raised by this platform, but really also about the opportunity to freely discuss and negotiate and argue about different ways that these technologies can be used, who is benefiting from their innovation, and who is benefiting from the data they produce, and whose perspectives are being furthered and propagated with the proliferation of both the platforms and their information. And that's where we were able to leave it, that essentially it became more about being sensitive to the process, being sensitive to that pluralism despite the talk of populism, and pushing forward, I would say, with a renewed commitment to that kind of difference and these kinds of Frankenstein maps and new math and new methods that reject the first pretty image of the city, to know that the image is not actually that, the city is not that pretty, right? And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
I'm going to kick off with a question, and then I'm actually going to turn the mic over to our grad students who are going to help lead the question subsequently. But this idea of being able to capture difference and put it in a system that you can then evaluate, compare, contrast. Can you just expand upon how you felt that the Share prototype was able to capture that difference, and talk about the idea of context? It was really great, that image you showed where the things were outlined against this kind of messy context.
And that's clearly a polished image of representation of the project. There's a part of the satire in which a lot of the material we put out is meant to mimic that of a startup who is putting out this platform, we'll say, for realsies. Absolutely. I think on one hand, the way the interface itself, or the interaction, that minimal quantification and sort of maximum sort of open schema, so image-based data collection, and then sort of the interpretive act of drawing, those two alone start to capture a lot of differential experiences and perspectives. When you then limit the sort of description or use and use value to text, that opens up a lot of different kinds of analysis. It also allows for many different ways of contributing information about a certain location. You can imagine, a single park or plaza having sort of parsed up differently, individual locations described differently, given different historical meanings, or referenced as landmarks by some and just places of convenience by others. You could start to see, and again, so the platform itself went live in the beta form with the opening of the Triennale, which is September, so we haven't had a lot of time yet, but it does work in New York, even if it was designed for the Copenhagen case, hint, hint. But there is a point at which I think going in and seeing what sorts of things have been included in that on the platform, or listed and offered up to others, the sort of difference between what quantity is private, what quantity is public, can start to speak to how people think about sharing and collectivity, which types of users or which users would share certain kinds of objects in certain locations, the extent to which they cluster, either socially or spatially, based on who's pinging who in order to reserve them. There's another detail to the ever complex satire that I didn't mention, and that is we took a pretty hardline stance about handling the transaction for the user, in which we said no. So if you want to reserve someone's privately held object, one email goes out CCing both people, introducing each other, and you don't get away from sort of that transactional negotiation on this platform. It's the Craigslist model rather than this sort of Airbnb model where their lawyers have gone over those terms for you. And as a platform, as a tool, I think it's open enough, an open interpretation enough to be able to collect all sorts of evidence of difference, and then to allow for the sort of later analysis of that difference. I think that answers your question.
Yeah. I would be curious to know if there were any surprises in the way somebody categorized or tagged something to share.
I would have to go back and look. There are definitely surprises in terms of sort of, in its early phases, there's a lot of posting of people as a sort of way of introducing you to them. In the workshops, a few things in the sort of workshops and focus groups of the engagement process, before it launched, there was definitely a very interesting discussion of different niche communities that could use the platform in different ways, ranging from expectant mothers who want to be able to share or just dispose of easily their various supplies, to people sharing household tools, because do you really need a circular saw, to planning bodies and academic researchers who very quickly saw the opportunity as a research tool. So that I didn't realize that would be so transparent.
My thesis is one of the things I'm looking at in my thesis is Blue Apron, the meal kit delivery service, which I think sort of has Geographies as one of its kind of selling points, or like putting Geographies in the consumer's mind as one of its selling points. And so I was looking the other day at sort of how they, in their imagery, play on things like co-ops, food co-ops. Mm-hmm. And I liked your idea of Frankenstein-ness. And I was wondering whether you thought there was a link, like whether sharing economies were a sort of mutation of things like co-ops, and whether that opened a possibility for it to mutate in another way, or mutate back to having more pluralistic values.
I can't speak, I think, specifically to the Blue Apron example, and I don't think I know enough there. But I can say that I think it's one example of hybridizing on-demand services with geolocative services. The latter came to the fore, started to enter into our sort of day-to-day life before on-demand services. It actually enabled that. And I'm not entirely sure what their combination is going to mutate into, but I have a hunch that their Frankenstein is not so much a Frankenstein. That what we're going to see are products and services that are accelerations of existing modes or existing sort of forms or products, rather than substantively or qualitatively different than those that we currently have, right? And that's something that the incrementalization of space and time has really allowed. That the smaller those increments get, the more resolved or more resolute they become, the more targeted and more specialized we can be in approaching consumers or markets. The more targeted and specialized we can be in thinking about infrastructural service delivery on one hand, but also about sort of essentially how to extract more rents out of those parcels of space and time, or sell more services into those parcels of space and time.
Maps, they're always like plan view maps? Are there any maps that are like from a person's like my eye perspective, or like, is there mapping happening like that? Are you working on anything like that, or what would that look like? Or
there are definitely non-planimetric in any sort of rigorous, formal sense ways of mapping. There are definitely ways of drawing even quantitative spatial relationships in section or in elevation, or as one moves through the street. There's definitely ways of visualizing video material alongside quantitative data, and sort of locating those via landmarks or other sort of on-the-ground reference points. I think all of that can fall under the category of mapping. The plan view itself, most maps, cartographers never talk about it. When we don't talk about it enough. But they have a perspective, they have a projection that's usually thought through and intentional. And so just saying, from above is one thing. Which view from above the map takes is another. I personally sort of almost consistently employ that from above view, that sort of plan-based map as a strategic device, or as almost a tactical device, right? So I will share this with you. This is another secret. Maps are among the most trusted forms of communication, more trusted than words and more trusted than stats. People trust what they read on a map. You map the information that is pretty much going to be regarded as capital T true. Clearly, you can tell that I'm working hard to kind of undo some of that, but I also understand as a communicative tool, as an argumentative tool, as a rhetorical tool, that being able to harness that trust and that power, the power that comes with that kind of trusted authority, is not only interesting, but is a sort of communicative starting point for a lot of my work. That said, there are plenty of other different perspectives you can take in drawing a map. It's intentional that most of mine are from above.
Other people? Questions?
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about, do you have any advice for, like, I'm doing my thesis about townships in South Africa, and how would you advise me or other people working on areas to approach a project using maps? Like, where would I start?
Do you have maps, or do you want to make maps?
I don't have maps yet, but I have potential maps.
Like historical maps?
Yes.
Okay. There's no easy answer. I only have follow-up questions, like what are the maps about? What is your thesis about? Like what are the other? Okay, I can give a general, broad, super unhelpful response, which is to say, one map, or just like one, you can think of the map as its own set of information, its own data, right? That alone can't tell you the story other than the one the designer is trying to get you to read out of it, and the story of where the data come from. So just like I was saying before, it's a meaningful analysis is gonna come out of being able to combine, recombine, compare it to other spatial visualizations, either across time or from different communities, from different kinds of decision makers, or when the map maker is asking a different kind of question, what do they start to draw out from the environment? What in those cases is deemed important enough to render on the map, right? And then there's that process of layering those perspectives and trying to see your question at hand from as many different angles as possible, as a sort of resultant of these sort of combined and recombined conditions. Thanks. So in other words, more maps. Yeah. Okay.
And an agendaless map is a naive fantasy.
No such thing.
Cool.
No such thing.
Yeah.
Outright, hold on. It is such a thing. It's an idea,
Yeah.
and it's a fable, and it's a lie. A lie is a thing,
Yeah.
and that's what kind of thing it is.
Other questions from the peanut gallery?
I feel like I understand what you mean when you talk about your work being extra empirical, in the sense of above empirical, beyond the realm of empirical, but also encompassing empiricism.
Empirical methods are involved because we're clearly observing phenomena at specific locations and then documenting them.
However, my question is how we as people who do this kind of work can use these tools in what's been called post-fact era.
So that's extra charged. I'm going to out David as a former student of mine. Sorry, not sorry. In In genuine, well-meaning terms? Is that the question? Or in farcical and or subversive parodying terms?
You're the only person who I think can give a very good answer to like a lot of.
Okay, in the post-fact era. Make more defensible representations of information, whether those are textual or graphic or infographics or whatever, right, or statistical. Defensible visualizations or representations of information, and when I say make more, I mean make multiple of the same thing, right? That I would like to see a pushing of the fact that every story can have, we know this. You ask two people who got into an argument what happened, they're going to tell you two completely different stories. So it goes with our information. In other words, there are, I think, well-meaning ways to embrace the post-fact era, and that might mean not only in that acknowledging pluralism in cities means acknowledging pluralism in our representations thereof, and we're going to need more. I mean, I can give a really teacherly answer and say, clearly all our maps need more text, and we need to cite our sources, and we need to evaluate those, and et cetera, et cetera. I also think that there's a kind of practice of counterfactualism that could become an activism, right? That, I don't know how many times in the last few months I heard claims about inner cities, and wanted to then map inner cities about those claims. The campaign, I had a project that went a little bit defunct because of the rhetoric of the campaigns, but campaign mapping is still online. You guys can look at it, which are again sort of taking non-facts or anti-facts and fact-checking / reinterpreting, and usually offering more than one interpretation of the fact-checking, right? There's a kind of, I think there's an opportunity for a kind of counterfactual activism that is not fake, no fake news, no fake facts, but to show the multiple perspectives and that each one of them is legitimately defensible, that each one of them is statistically valid, right? It's just a matter of whose data set you ask, or which framework you use to evaluate value, et cetera. It's a kind of interesting practice, I think.
Hi, my name's Joe. Fantastic talk. I was just curious about how accessible some of these technologies are, and sort of what was like your driver in terms of latching onto these and really like exploring and tinkering around.
Like the tools to actually make some of these things?
Yeah.
Not very at all.
Oh.
Not even close. No, okay. That said, when I say certain new opportunities are opening up, not only in academia and academic research, but also in practice, I think right now we are standing very close to a point that where computationally we can do this at small scales. I'm not asking for like global analysis of climate change, but local or city level analysis of certain social indicators and factors and relationships. I think that especially with trends toward open data that is sort of standardized and structured so that you could sort of make off-the-shelf tools, that can happen. Now, there's a danger there because, as I mentioned, super user-friendly map-making apps tend not to ask you, well, what do you mean by how far is it? And what are the impediments to access for the audience you're mapping for? And they don't ask these questions. Technologically and computationally, they could. I'll put it that way. They could all be better. It's not the same right now as putting sort of sophisticated GIS software in the hands of an everyday user and expecting them to know how to deal with the math. but there's a lot of the translation and sort of putting into practice of this kind of thinking, methodological thinking, that could be done tomorrow. And with any luck, people are working on that, and I encourage other people to work on that, and sometimes I work on that. And then from tomorrow, increasingly, I think it could be a lot more accessible. I think the only thing stopping us is a willingness to see multiplicity.
What about protections from oversharing? I'm thinking about not only sharing economies, but surveillance and self-tracking, mapping.
That's a different talk.
Views.
Oh, do I have views? Who in this room doesn't have a view? How doesn't have views on that question? Could you narrow it down?
Yeah. All right.
What-
Well, I'm
what
thinking
part of that- yeah.
particularly of public health, going back to the beginning of your talk.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm looking at chronically ill people that are collectively sharing data.
Okay. There are obviously, I didn't use the word ethics or ethical in the talk, but there are clearly ethical issues raised in, at least when we talk about visualization and analysis. And there are similarly ethical issues raised in where privacy is concerned for collection purposes. I mean, we have, for very good reason, protections in place for human information, human subject information when it comes to research. And I think the principle of that needs to be understood when dealing with shared information and volunteered information in two ways, I think. And this may or may not be directly tied to your question. Also, I reserve the right to change my mind about this once I think about it more. But off the top of my head, this is what I'm going to go with. On one hand, non-anonymous, non-aggregated, identifiable information is dangerous out there in the world for all the reasons we already know, right? On the other hand, when it's volunteered, when it's crowdsourced, when people are part of that crowd and in the spirit of sort of collectivity sharing it, it's also not the most verifiable. Its veracity is often limited because we know that, sort of social behaviors are different when you're sort of there's self-representation without protection. I'd be curious to see how that kind of volunteered, shared, crowdsourced information is used in such an empirical field like public health, like epidemiology. I'd be curious to know what kinds of analytical methods or sort of competency or sort of accounting is done to sort of to weigh responses, their clarity, their veracity, their validity, and so on. So I'm not going to touch the privacy concern right now so much because I think we all sort of understand that. But I think once incorporating that kind of information, that kind of shared information into analysis, it's really hard to be able to make meaningful comparisons between users because of what you didn't control for, because of what you can't standardize, and because you can't know the extent to which it's reliable. Make sense? That's what I'm going to go with.